In this video, we're going to look at an overview of the digestive system. So we'll look briefly at the structures that are part of the gastrointestinal tract, which is where the food moves through, and the accessory organs that contribute to the digestive process. And then we're going to just zoom in very briefly and look at the tissue layers of a section of the digestive tract. Our digestive tract begins with the oral cavity, or our mouth, and this is where we take in food and we chew it up and start mechanically breaking it down into small enough pieces that we will be able to swallow. When we have food in our mouth, we start to secrete saliva from our salivary glands. We have the parotid, the sublingual, and the submandibular salivary glands, and they are going to add liquid plus some digestive enzymes to the mouth cavity to help us break down our food particles into smaller particles, also to make it moist so that it's easier to swallow. When we swallow our food, it's going to go through the pharynx, which is the back of our throat. Now, the pharynx is common with the respiratory system, and the trachea is in front of the esophagus. So when we are breathing, air is going into the trachea. When we swallow food, this little extension here, that is called our epiglottis, and that will push down and cover the trachea, which prevents food from being pushed down into our respiratory tract. So as our food moves past the pharynx, then it is going to move into the esophagus. And this contains muscles that will move in a rhythmic fashion, pushing the food down into the stomach. So then we have our stomach, and this is where we secrete hydrochloric acid, and we start to digest some proteins with some enzymes. We will look at that in more detail in the next video. The stomach has a lot of very strong muscles that will contract and mix the food until it is very, very mechanically broken down into very small pieces so that it becomes a liquid called chyme. And then the food is going to move through the small intestine. Now, the small intestine has a narrow diameter, so this over here, this is all part of the small intestine. You can see that it has a very small diameter. So this is where the food goes after the stomach. And the small intestine has three regions. It has the duodenum, which is the very first portion. Then the middle portion is called the jejunum. And then the last portion is called the ileum. Okay, so three components of the small intestine. Most of our food is digested and absorbed in this very first part of the small intestine, the duodenum. And again, we'll talk about that in more detail in the next video. So as the food moves through the small intestine, more and more nutrients are being absorbed into the bloodstream, and then we're going to reach the large intestine, which begins with the cecum. The appendix hangs off of the cecum, so this is the lower right side of your abdominal cavity, and it's going to move up through the ascending colon, across the transverse colon, down the descending colon, to the S-shaped end region called the sigmoid colon, and then we have this storage area here called the rectum. And then when we go to the bathroom, it is going to pass through the muscle ring at the very end called the anus. So now we have accessory structures. So I already talked about the salivary glands. They are also accessory structures because food doesn't go into the salivary glands. The salivary glands contribute secretions into the alimentary canal to help digestion. And then we also have three other organs that are very important accessory organs. And that is our liver, our gallbladder, and our pancreas. So those organs will secrete substances into the alimentary canal to help us digest. Now, the liver doesn't secrete anything directly into the digestive tract. The liver will produce bile, and bile helps us to break down fats. So bile is produced by the liver, and it will be stored by the gallbladder. And then when you consume food and it starts to get into the small intestine, then the gallbladder will contract and the bile will go into the small intestine and help us digest fat. And the pancreas plays a very, very important role in helping us digest food. It makes a lot of digestive enzymes that will help us chemically break down food. And it produces bicarbonate, which helps us regulate the pH. So when our food is in the stomach, it is a very acidic environment. Our stomach cells produce hydrochloric acid, and we need this for a couple of reasons. One main reason is to kill pathogens that we eat with our food. We swallow a lot of bacteria when we're eating food, so hydrochloric acid helps to kill that. And hydrochloric acid also helps to activate a molecule called pepsinogen, which will become pepsin. And that is an enzyme that can start breaking down protein. So in the stomach, protein is the only macronutrient that will start to be enzymatically digested. So then when those contents of the stomach, very acidic contents, reach the small intestine, we have to neutralize that pH. We have to increase the pH. The small intestine is a very alkaline environment, so the digestive enzymes that the pancreas makes, that it secretes into the small intestine, and the enzymes the small intestine itself produces, they need to function in an alkaline environment. So the bicarbonate produced by the pancreas neutralizes the acid. Now, just a little bit of vocabulary. So I've already mentioned mechanical and chemical digestion. So I want to just go through a few terms to make sure that you understand the difference. Okay, so when we consume food, when we put food into our mouth and start chewing, that is called ingestion. And then when we use our teeth to chew up the food, or when our stomach muscles or the small intestine muscles are contracting to mix up and break down the big food particles into small food particles, okay, that is called mechanical digestion. And then when we use digestive enzymes to, say, break down a protein into individual amino acids, that is chemical digestion. When we move substances into the lumen of the digestive tract, so when the stomach makes hydrochloric acid, or when the pancreas is releasing enzymes or bicarbonate into the lumen of the small intestine, that is called secretion. So when accessory organs or your salivary glands are putting substances into the digestive tract, that is called secretion. When we fully chemically break down our nutrients and then they move into the bloodstream, that is called absorption. And then the last thing is when all of the waste products that are left at the end that will form in the large intestine, that when we release that, that is called defecation. Ingestion is occurring in the mouth, and this is when we take in food. Also, these processes are happening only in the mouth. Nothing happens in the esophagus except just transportation from the mouth to the stomach. Okay, so number 2 is our mechanical digestion. This is when we're breaking large food molecules into small food molecules. So this will happen in the mouth when we're chewing. It will happen in the stomach when the stomach muscles are contracting. It will happen in the small intestine when the small intestine muscles are also contracting. Okay, so mechanical digestion happens in the mouth, stomach, and intestine. Number 3 is our chemical digestion. So this is when we're using enzymes to break food down into, from its polymer, its large macromolecule, into its building blocks, like taking a protein and breaking it into amino acids. So some chemical digestion will happen in the mouth. We have 2 enzymes. One is called lipase, and one is called amylase. These enzymes are found in the saliva, and lipase will start to break down fats, and amylase will start to break down starch. We also have some chemical digestion in the stomach. As I said earlier, we have an enzyme called pepsin that will start to break down protein. So there's chemical digestion in the mouth and in the stomach, and as well as the small intestine. In the next video, we will look at more detail of the different kinds of enzymes that are produced either by the small intestine or by the pancreas that break down all kinds of different nutrients in the small intestine. Number 4 is secretion, and this is when we are adding substances to the alimentary canal to help digestion. So we do add substances in the mouth. This is our saliva. Okay, so we have salivary secretions. In the stomach, we have secretions of hydrochloric acid and pepsinogen and mucus to help protect the lining of the stomach. In the small intestine, we also have secretions because the small intestine produces digestive enzymes, and the pancreas, gallbladder, they will be releasing substances into the alimentary canal. And then absorption. So with absorption, this is when we are moving substances from the digestive tract into our bloodstream. So very, very small amounts of absorption can technically occur in the mouth, but it is not a primary area where absorption normally occurs. So you can absorb a little bit of water and a little bit of alcohol in through your mucosal tissue in your mouth, but generally the absorption of nutrients is primarily going to occur in the small intestine. We will have a little bit that can occur in the stomach as well. We can absorb a significant amount of water and also alcohol in the stomach. But most of the absorption is going to be occurring in the small intestine, specifically in the duodenum, which is the very first part of the small intestine. And then we will have a little bit of absorption in the large intestine because the large intestine can also absorb water. Now, I want to just point out here that most of the water that we absorb is happening in the small intestine. We absorb more water in the small intestine than we do in the large intestine. But the large intestine will reabsorb just a bit more water that's left. Okay, so it's still a fairly significant amount, but just keep in mind that most of it is absorbed actually in the small intestine. Now, in the large intestine, this is where we are basically left with the undigested particles, mostly fiber. So when we eat fibrous foods like plants, the cellulose cell wall of plants, we can't digest that. It's a type of carbohydrate, a polysaccharide, and we don't digest that. So that becomes waste. Okay, but it is also actually very important because it provides bulk, which stimulates the contraction of our large intestine, which makes us have bowel movements, right? We want to be able to eliminate waste at least once a day. And if you don't have enough fiber, then you may not go to the bathroom every single day. And then when waste products build up in the large intestine, and if it stays there and you're not eliminating it, the large intestine will continue to absorb more and more and more water, right? And then what's that going to do? That's going to make it more difficult to have a bowel movement. And this is called constipation. So it's very important to have fiber in our diet so that we can have bulk in the large intestine that helps to promote elimination. And then lastly, we have defecation, and that is happening down here in the rectum where we contract those muscles and we actually have the bowel movement. Let's just summarize the functions of the digestive system. We need to mechanically and chemically break down food particles. We need to absorb those molecules, those nutrients into our bloodstream. We need to remove waste products. We also store in our large intestine or house microorganisms. Okay, we have microflora or normal flora, and these are bacterial organisms, at least 1,000 different species. If we're healthy, we have a lot of variation, and maybe 300 or so predominant categories of microorganisms that live in our digestive tract. They have a very important function in helping us to digest our food and to regulate our immune response. Okay, there's a lot of different functions. They actually also help to digest some of that fiber. They eat some of the fiber that we consume, and they do lots of really good things for our digestive system and our whole body. And we'll talk about that in more detail in a future video. Our digestive tract also produces a substance called intrinsic factor. Our stomach makes intrinsic factor that helps us to absorb a specific nutrient called vitamin B12. We use vitamin B12 for lots of different things, but one primary thing is for making red blood cells that carry oxygen. So if you don't have intrinsic factor and you can't absorb vitamin B12, you can become anemic. The last thing that I want to look at in this video is I want to just look at a cross-section of a portion of the digestive tract. And I want to just look at the tissues that make up the digestive tract. So if we have a look over here, and let's just suppose this is a portion of the small intestine. There's many, many layers of tissue, and it includes all of the 4 basic types of tissues. We have epithelial cells. Okay, so the epithelium is what is going to absorb the nutrients. The nutrients are going to move through the epithelium, and they will eventually end up in blood vessels. So this opening here is called the lumen, and this is where our food is digesting. The surrounding the epithelium is loose connective tissue, and we call that the lamina propria, and it will contain lymphatic tissue and some blood vessels, and then this is where absorption is going to occur. It will occur, fats will be absorbed into the lymphatic tissue, and other nutrients are absorbed into the blood. In this mucosal layer, we also have glands that will be secreting substances into the lumen to help digestion. So the mucosal layer is the innermost layer. And then we have the submucosal layer, which is the middle layer. This is also loose connective tissue. It helps to protect the inner layers, but it's also very flexible so that as your muscles are contracting and you're digesting food and you have bulk amounts of food molecules in there, the connective tissue keeps everything together while still being flexible. And so in this submucosal layer, there's blood vessels that are bringing oxygen and nutrients to the digestive tract, as well as absorbing nutrients. So the nutrients we absorb are going to go into our vascular system and to our liver. The other component that is really important is the nervous system component. So we have 2 major groups of neurons that regulate digestion. So we have their autonomic or enteric neurons, and we have a submucosal plexus, which plays a really important role in secretions, and the myenteric plexus, which plays a really important role in muscle contractions. So when we are digesting food, if we just think quickly about our autonomic nervous system, we have the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic is our fight or flight response that we need to activate when we have stress. And the parasympathetic is our rest and digest. So when we are eating food, it's really important to be calm and not stressed when you're eating food so that your parasympathetic nervous system can fully activate your secretions and your digestive muscles, and then you can more properly digest food. And then we have our muscle layers. We have a circular muscle layer and a longitudinal muscle layer. The circular muscle layer contracts and moves the food back and forth within, say, a section of the small intestine to increase mechanical digestion. And the longitudinal muscle propels the food through the digestive tract. And the whole entire gastrointestinal tract is covered with a 3rd and final layer of connective tissue called the serosa. The last thing that I want to talk about is the mesentery. The mesentery is like an apron of connective tissue that contains fat cells. And it will also have blood vessels, and it will also have lymphatic tissue. And this is what connects our intestines to the abdominal wall. So if we didn't have mesentery, then all of our intestines, small and large intestines, gravity would just pull them all down to the bottom of our abdominal cavity. So the mesentery is connective tissue that keeps all of our digestive organs in place. And it's connecting all of the digestive organs to the peritoneal wall. So inside the abdominal cavity, that's the peritoneal cavity, we have a coating of connective tissue that coats the cavity, and that's called the parietal peritoneum. And then the connective tissue that covers the outside of our digestive organs, that's called the visceral peritoneum. And so those connective tissues combine to form this mesentery. And then there's also fat in there. The last thing that I want to mention, which is just super interesting, is the fat that is contained in the mesentery. It's called visceral fat. And we also have visceral fat that is inside of some of our organs, especially the liver, and surrounding all of the digestive organs. Okay, whereas our normal fat, the healthy fat that we store that's excess energy, like our triglycerides that we can break down and make energy from, that is subcutaneous. So when you have fat underneath your skin, that is your subcutaneous fat, and that is what we use for energy. But when you have a lot of visceral fat, this is what is particularly correlated with chronic diseases like heart disease and cancer and Alzheimer's disease and chronic inflammatory conditions. So this visceral fat or belly fat, we can increase that if we have a lot of stress, because cortisol is a stress hormone that tells your body to store fat in your viscera. Okay, so if you have a problem with belly fat, one of the first things that you want to look at is what are your stress levels. So to reduce visceral fat, it's very important to have a healthy diet and get lots of exercise and try to reduce your stress.